Welcome to the American Diversity Report podcasts, where we interview diverse changemakers and innovators. I'm Deborah Levine, the editor of the American Diversity Report and your host, and with me today is Alan Chapell. He is an attorney, singer, songwriter, and band leader. Based in New York City, he tours the world. He is influenced heavily by 80s and 90s music, me too, but his lyrics reflect the world around him. Welcome, Alan.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and wonderful to meet you, Deborah.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to hearing about your work and how it came to be. Let's start off with how you came to be a lawyer.
Well, it's one of those things that as long as I can remember, uh, relatives like I come from an Irish working class family, and everybody said I had the gift of gab, and 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 somehow that translated into I was going to go to law school, and that was something that somehow became like part of our family lore since I was 5 or 6 years old, and and what happened along the way is I said, well, wait a minute, I think I really want to be a musician. And I tried that for a while, and went and lived in India, and did tours in a bunch of places. Um, and then came back to New York City and thought, well, maybe I should try to get a real job now, and decided to go to law school. And what happened is that what really turned me on was human rights law. To me, that was, and then European Union law was also pretty interesting. And so I had a real passion for human rights law, and that ultimately led me into the privacy world. Because if you think about human rights law in a nutshell, it's about trying to convince a very large entity to do something that they are not legally compelled to do. And privacy law is almost identical. Now, there's more and more laws today, but when I was starting in the privacy world 20 years ago, there weren't a whole heck of a lot of laws out there. And so there were industry codes, and this is the right thing to do. And if you do this type of thing, um, there may be less friction for your sales team, that sort of thing. And I found myself making very similar arguments in that world. And then I also discovered the digital media. I think back then they were calling it new media world. And so all of those things sort of came together. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been advising tech companies on privacy issues. And it's
Wow.
been a wonderful experience because every day is different. Um, and also because it helps fund the musical side.
Yes, I imagine that that's very helpful. Artists are not known for necessarily bringing in the big bucks, huh?
One of the more sobering things that I've learned over the last decade is, as I've gotten to meet some people who are by all accounts pretty famous. Um, Boy, you would think that they would have more cash in their wallet to show for that, and that isn't always the case.
No, unfortunately, we don't value artists the way we should.
Well, I would agree with that. It's funny, and sort of in a related note, my wife Maria was just at the Time Magazine 100 Most Influential Persons Award in New York City. That's one of the wonderful things about living in New York, is that you get invited to that type of a thing. And she had a wonderful time, and just what a great event, and they couldn't have been nicer. But one thing that she noticed is, to her right was somebody who'd spent the last 20 years studying glaciers, so as to better understand the implications of global warming. Uh, and on her left was a reality or a TikTok star. Um, and it's sort of interesting how time brings those two very different personalities together. And I'm not here to criticize anybody, but just to make the comment that I think Time Magazine realized that sometimes you need to have the TikTok star to get anybody to pay attention to the person taking photos of the glaciers.
Wow. You know, I lived in New York for a while, so I understand what you mean.
It's a wonderful place that is maddeningly difficult to live in at times, but is so wonderful that I really couldn't imagine myself anywhere else.
I can understand. I do miss it sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. So during this 20 years of your legal journey, you've also done the music sort of side by side?
I have. So when I first went to law school in the late 90s, I had really given up on music. I was working full time. I just had my daughter Kylie, and and I was going to law school full time. And there just wasn't a lot of room for music. But as I got a couple of years into school, my dad, who is a jazz musician, took me aside and he said, "Hey, I don't really understand. You want to play music, right?" I said, "Well, yeah, just well, make time for it. Like, what are you waiting around for?" And he really inspired me to start back up with it. So, I took a couple of years off, and then it's just one of those things that if it's inside you in that way, it just never really leaves you. And started writing and playing with friends and just doing a little bit because I didn't have a lot of time in the late 90s. Um, but what ended up happening was little by little you start writing songs and then you start recording them and literally it feels like a minute later I'm in the studio recording with Jerry Harrison, who's probably best known as one of the Talking Heads, but is also a pretty well-renowned music producer and has become one of my favorite people, in part because Jerry is able to straddle both the music and the business world in a way that is seamless because it's still very much Jerry, regardless of which role he's playing. But he's also opened some doors for me and gotten me introduced to some really interesting things happening, and I'm grateful for it.
Wonderful. Goodness. Well, imagine finding a recording studio in New York is not too terribly difficult, not as difficult as finding the time to be in there.
Well, one of the things that's happened over the last couple of years is that the technology is such that you can do a lot of stuff at home. And that's had a little bit of a negative impact on a lot of those big recording studios who were flush with cash, back in the 80s and 90s. But for the musician who, wants to be able to create and doesn't necessarily want to wait for a studio to be available, it's a pretty wonderful thing. And I use my MacBook Air to write and to record, and it's just so much fun.
What about when you come to the issue of time? What about all your worldwide travels? How do you fix that in?
Well, I'm fortunate because I can work from anywhere, and I've been able to do that for most of the last 20 years. And so and my wife has a pretty flexible schedule too. And so we're going to spend a couple of months in the Bay Area again this summer, and I'll play some shows there. I've already got a couple that are tentative but look pretty good. And whenever we go to Europe, I end up playing a couple of shows. I'll be in Seattle in a week or 2 weeks, and it looks like I've got a show out there. And so it's really wonderful when you can integrate your life in that way. And I feel very blessed that I've been able to do it.
Yes, that sounds wonderful. Busy, but wonderful. So you've been doing this for 20 years. What's going to happen next?
Boy, it's a good question. I feel like I'm at the point now where uh, what I'm really looking to do is to try to build out the audience to the point where, I've been very lucky to do a whole bunch of opening band shows with, the Gin Blossoms and Everclear and Lisa Loeb and a whole bunch of folks. And really what I'm really trying to do now is to try to build out the following, so that that when next time I'm playing in front of eight or 900 people, that they're all there specifically to see me.
How do you do that? How do you build that out?
Boy, it's a really good question. I think a lot of it these days is I never want to say it's luck, but it is a little bit of luck and a lot of persistence. Strangely, I just found out the New York Times has started putting my songs on their Spotify playlists. And
Oh,
so that's wonderful. Now I have no idea how that happened. And if there's anybody from the New York Times listening, let me buy you a beer at some point. But that kinds of stuff is how these things tend to grow. And it's interesting because in rock music, generally it's a younger person's game. And I'm certainly not old, but I'm not 20 anymore. And so my demographic of 30 to 50-year-old people tend to be rather busy, and so it becomes a little bit of a challenge to cut through the clutter. But I'm doing a show at the Bitter End, and we decided to do it on Monday of next week, of just to try it. And it's interesting because it's almost sold out, which is funny because sometimes when you try to do something on a Friday or Saturday, there's just too many other options for people. And so maybe this Monday thing will be the ticket to fame and fortune.
explain to our audience what the bitter end is.
So the Bitter End is sort of a unique place. It's a musical venue on Bleecker Street that I am old enough to remember. Bleecker Street was the center of the musical universe, probably starting in the 60s and into the 70s. And Bob Dylan has played there, and it was kind of a coffee house thing back in the 60s and 70s. But in the 1980s, starting from CBGB's, which is on one side of Bleecker Street, and then you go in towards the Bitter End over towards 6th Avenue. That little strip was the live music strip in New York City. And it was so happening. It had NYU there, which it still does, but it was such a happening scene. And unfortunately, CBGB's is no longer there. And the Bitter End is almost the last venue standing after these 40 or 50 years. And to their credit, they're still going strong.
Good. I believe I was there back in the late 1960s. That's what I was asking.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's it. So, and that was back when it was more of a coffee house, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it was.
Oh, history. And the
Yeah.
people you must have seen there, that's just amazing.
Well, I finished my senior year in college at NYU in Greenwich Village, and it was 1969 or 70, and yeah, it was hippie world.
I can only imagine the stories and the scenes from going to NYU in the late 60s and early 70s. That's a fun time.
Yes, it was. People
Let
used
me
to
ask you, and I
cross
know
the
this is
street.
this
Yeah.
is the you're supposed to be interviewing me, but I've just got to ask. Looking back, it seemed like such a fun and exciting time. Did it feel that way back then, or was it so upending that it was a little scary?
Well, I had to leave Harvard because of my health. So ending up at NYU in Greenwich Village wouldn't have been my first choice. But I always feel that the good Lord had that in mind so that I would be exposed to the true 60s in Greenwich Village, Hippieville, instead of the Ivory Tower. So it was definitely an experience that shaped me. There was an ashram where they taught yoga, which I had never seen before, and I decided to take that on the way to class. So it was a cultural shift that actually really suited me more than I had ever thought. And I'm very fortunate to have that experience.
Wow, what a great experience.
Yeah.
I still practice yoga just a couple of blocks north of Union Square. I'm sorry, just south of Union Square, just north
Oh,
of
that's
Washington
interesting.
Square.
Wow. Maybe we have more in common than we realize.
Well, I have found, for me at least, that yoga is an integral part of my writing process. Um, I usually pick one day a weekend um, where that's writing day, and yoga is the start of that. You go and you practice, and then around noon, and from noon until midnight, my I literally walk around the West Village trying to find words, and it's kind of a wonderfully inspiring place. And so there's I suppose one can write anywhere, but if given the choice, I do some of my writing in West Village and some of my writing down by the houseboats in Sausalito, California, and which has its own sort of unique talk about hippiedom history.
Yeah. Well, that's probably very good advice for a young person who might want to be a songwriter. Is that there needs to be that quiet place inside your head so that you can generate that creativity.
I think that's well said. I think that you have to dedicate a certain amount of time every day to just being quiet and allowing the writing to come to you, and particularly when you're younger. And I think that's why a lot of very successful writers and artists tend to be people who are a little antisocial and a little quiet, because if you're not careful, life will set your schedule for you, and you will find thousands of things to be busy with. And if writing is a priority, you really does mean you have to push back on some of that other stuff, even if it's fun stuff.
So true. There's a reason why I've been able to publish 15 books.
Absolutely. And I mean, just what an accomplishment to be able to do that.
Well, it takes that kind of quiet, solitary, you know, meditation, however you want to put it, to be able to chase down the creative thoughts, make go with them wherever they're going, so that you can travel together.
Yes, absolutely. And I found it's helpful to both have the sense of self and self-confidence to know that you have something that the world wants to hear or should hear. Um, but you need to balance that with a sense of self-reflection, because not every word that you write or every note that you play is going to be gold, and you really have to be honest with yourself about what's working and what isn't.
Yeah. So, of all the songs that you've created, which one resonates with you the most?
It's always the most recent song that I've written.
Okay. How
uh,
many have you written?
oh, I don't know. I mean, hundreds.
Oh,
Maybe we've gotten up to 1,000.
oh,
Um, but I've recorded only about 100 of them. And then another 50 to 75 have been what I would call demo recordings, but never quite made it into, a formal recording process. Um, but I don't know if you experience this as a writer. I tend to fall in and out of love with particular songs as you maybe find a unique side, or all of a sudden something in your life is drawing you to sing that particular song. One of the things I really love about playing solo is that I can, on a whim, decide I'm going to completely change up the set list and just play something that I haven't played in several years. And that's a little harder to do with a 5 or 6 piece band. Um, and and uh, and so it's really wonderful to be able to have that level of flexibility, and that level of intimacy with the solo shows.
Yeah. Are most of your shows solo?
Well, in COVID times, I would say more and more of them had been, because that was the opportunities that presented themselves. Uh, I think starting this fall, we're going to do a tour with the full band, and that will be wonderful. There's really nothing like. I've got some great musicians, and they're wonderful people, and they're super talented, and we come together like a nice little family with all its good and bad, I suppose.
So you're going to go on tour, huh? Where are you going to go and how long are you going to be out there?
We're going to be doing something mostly focused around the Northeast, because as I said, I'm really trying to build something in and around New York City. And fortunately, there are, I don't know, hundreds of really cool, 2 to 600 seat theaters within a 100-mile drive in New York, at least. And so I think we're going to be focusing mostly on that. The other thing about playing with the band is that, putting them on a plane to getting them to California and feeding and housing them tends to get a little expensive. So often when I have to travel pretty far, more often than not, I'll just do it as a solo show.
Okay. So with all of this going on, you've got family too, right?
I do.
How do you balance all that?
Well, I'm very lucky, because my wife is wonderfully supportive of everything that I do. And so we have a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old sings along with the songs and loves the music, but she's a 3-year-old, so it's, there are times where making music is a little bit more challenging when she's around. But my wife is really good about giving me space and giving me headspace to be able to write. But equally, I've had to learn to do a little bit more with a little less time, and that's just sort of the way, the way life goes.
How true. No matter where you are, who you are
Yeah.
these days. So I'm just curious, in your music, uh, does do your Irish roots rise up and that gift of gab come out?
Well, I like to be a storyteller in many of the songs, and so there's a lot of things that are really about, a particular friend who's gone through a certain thing, or just let me paint a picture about a particular person I met. Or, I remember I was in a yoga class, and the teacher was telling a story about some guy that she had met in a bar somewhere in East Brooklyn, and I was really struck by the story, but I didn't want to tell her story, so I framed it from the perspective of the guy she met in Brooklyn. And so you can take a little bit of liberties, even though I thought the story itself was kind of compelling, I wanted to tell a little bit of a different version of it. And I just really enjoy doing that.
Oh, I'm going to look forward to hearing that one.
Well, so that one is going to be on a double album that I'm hoping to release by the end of the year.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
Oh,
so in COVID times when nobody was really playing out, and I'd figured out a way through the wonders of modern technology. I was living out in the Bay Area with my wife and daughter, and we had figured out a way that I could actually record sitting in California with my band in different rooms in a studio in Brooklyn, and it worked really really well. And we did a whole bunch of songs, and uh, I'm still working through this is that part where we were talking a minute ago where you have to be honest with yourself about what's working and what isn't. And there's a lot of good in these, but it also, I've spent a lot of the last year or so rewriting things. Is this compelling? Is this really telling the story that I want to tell? Am I turning somebody off with this turn of phrase, even though I think it's funny? Is there that kinds of stuff? And
yeah.
my wife is wonderful at keeping me honest with myself on that kinds of stuff, because often what you might think is funny, your best friend or your partner or your spouse will be the truth teller.
Yep. There's no better editor than a loved one telling you the truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's actually helpful that my wife loves music, but she's not a trained musician. And in some ways that's helpful because she's not bound to anything other than, her moral center. And so I find her honesty is has been, we've been together what 8 years now, and if you look at the trajectory of the music that I've written in that time, um, I'm clearly in love.
Ah, well, that's wonderful. I'm very happy for you both and
Why,
for the
thank
little
you.
one. What is your daughter's name?
Her name is Rose, and
Rose. Perfect.
which is my maternal grandmother's name, Roseanne Sheridan, and but is also uh, my wife's mother's name, Rosa.
I
So
see.
we've got a nice little merger of the families with this.
Well, I have to tell you that my great great grandmother was also called Rose.
Wow, wonderful.
And I named my daughter after her.
Cool.
Yeah. So, with all of this wonderful life that you're leading, what would you have to say to a young person today, starting out in the music industry and wanting to be heard and to be able to do what you're doing, traveling and performing?
Well, I think that uh, the best advice anybody had ever given me was to just keep doing what you think is the right thing to do, and stick with that thing. And you may find, and I'm not trying to discourage anybody, but you may find that music isn't the thing, or it might not be the only thing. And I would say that had I not continued down the path of studying human rights law, I think my life would be very different, even though I think I would always have had the music as part of it. But I think I would have come at it from a slightly different place had I not had that. So I think everything is about persistence. I think that build a tribe, particularly if you're younger and you're at the point where those things are much more fluid. As you get older, you're sort of in many places you have kind of the same group of friends that you've had for the last 20 or 30 years sometimes. Not that that's bad, but that's just what it is. When you're 16, 18, 25, those relationships tend to be more fluid. And so find a tribe that you can build around, that's doing positive things, that's supportive, that are good people, but also that you can build your platform based on that tribe.
Oh, that's wonderful advice. I wish I'd known you when I was that age.
I, I wish I'd known that when I was that age too.
It's amazing what a few years will teach us, isn't it?
Yeah. My dad always liked to say that youth is wasted on the young.
And I had just heard that this morning at a meeting. It is apparently going around these days. Oh, I love it. So before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
No, this has been wonderfully engaging, and you know, my hope is that people who find this interesting and want to hear some of my music, a couple of places you can go. This is Chapell, CHAPELL.com. And then you can find me under that name on Spotify and Instagram and et cetera, et cetera. But if you can't figure out how to spell Chapell, uh, I wrote a song about my first daughter, Kylie, back when she was 6 or 7 years old, and it's called "Giving Her More." And I play that a lot when in my solo shows. It's still one of my favorite songs. But if you go to givinghermore.com, you'll find all my social info and how to find me on Spotify. And that might be easier for folks to remember, just givinghermore.com.
Okay. Well, I'm taking notes.
Okay.
Oh, I so appreciate this time. It sounds like you're really enjoying all of what you're doing. And that's the key, to be able to have fun while you're working so very, very hard at two jobs.
You have to you have to find something that you like. Life is way too short to waste it doing things that you don't like. And look, there's people who you know, life circumstances have led them in a place where they don't have those types of options. But while you have options, choose fun, choose passion, choose something you can be excited about, because everything in life is just too hard, and there's just no other path other than the path to some level of satisfaction by doing what you want.
I'm taking notes on that too. And audience, I hope you are also. Pay attention. And thank you for joining us, audience. And thank you so much, Alan, for sharing what is a wonderful life and career and inspiring. Really
Thank you
appreciate
so much, Deborah. It was a pleasure to be on the show.
it. All right.